morning. I am Paul Taillon, the host of this segment of Policy Insights Forum. Today, we are most fortunate to have two highly respected gentlemen to provide our audience their respective views on the People's Republic of China threat to North America and the West. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Charles Burton, a globally recognized authority on China, a senior fellow at MacDonald-Laurier Institute, Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad, and non-resident senior fellow, European Values Center for Security Policy. Also, I'm delighted to have with us Brigadier General Robert Spalding, PhD, noted author and authority on Chinese Communist Party, the methodologies, and has extensive experience dealing with China firsthand. Robert is also the author of two outstanding books, Stealth War, How China Took Over While America Elites Slept, and his latest one, War Without Rules. Good morning to both.
Morning.
Morning.
First question I'd like to get started is the book Unrestricted Warfare, which was published in 1999 and written by two PLA colonels, acknowledged the importance of employing a spectrum of military and non-military methods to provide an innovative, comprehensive, and effective strategy against the United States and Western nations. These consisted of a series of kinetic and non-kinetic methods that could be targeted against an enemy. For decades now, we have seen the People's Republic of China, PRC, effectively conducting this multifaceted strategy against the United States and the West. The non-kinetic methodologies included financial warfare, trade warfare, ecological warfare, psychological warfare, regulatory warfare, smuggling warfare, drug warfare, amongst other non-kinetic initiatives. Has the West dreamwalked into this myriad of challenges to our respective economic, political, and national security interests? If so, why has this happened? And are we too late to respond effectively? General, can you comment?
Oh, thank you. I think what the Chinese Communist Party recognized is something that in terms of when you think of warfare, there was a shift in how war was conducted, particularly after the use of the first atomic weapon. And I think what you've seen, certainly a massive decline in the number of casualties due to war, and this tendency for nuclear armed adversaries not to go to war, but for the United States, which had exited the Cold War as the dominant power, to use its military power almost without restraint, but only in those areas where the opponent didn't have a nuclear weapon. And so there was two trends that accompanied the kind of change in the overall character of war after nuclear weapons appeared, and that is globalization and the internet. At the end of the Cold War, the ability to trade freely, to move information freely. And I think after having studied how the Cold War ended for the Soviet Union, the realization that globalization and the internet really provided some unique opportunities to globalize the character of war that the Chinese Communist Party preferred, which is political warfare, really became evident. And so unrestricted warfare was the doctrine that basically codified the things that the Chinese Communist Party was seeing. And so doctrine that's typically developed for war is based on lessons learned. And so they were looking at where the world was going, the trends. They were taking lessons learned as the world was exiting the Cold War, the willingness of the United States and their allies to open up to former Soviet states, and the tendency for those states to turn democratic. So, with that and with the Tiananmen Square protests, the Chinese Communist Party recognized the opportunity lay in the technology, talent, and capital of the West, and the ability to use that for not only to gain in power, but also to essentially begin to underrun the West. The associated problems with that was ideology. And so they crafted a system that allowed for technology, talent, capital flow, but not for ideology. Once they established the bastion, that began to give them the ability, the security really to begin to go after the West using ideology. So and having leverage, technology, talent, and capital to bind U.S. Institutions like the corporate sector, the financial sector, the academic sector to them, they were able to unleash these into the West as proxies for their brand of warfare. So, unrestricted warfare is a beautiful doctrine. It's not strategy. It's meant to give principles to this character of war. And I think what the West missed was that war had changed fundamentally with globalization and the internet, and not in ways that were really conducive to promoting the principles and values of the West.
Charles, you've been talking about this for quite some time. You've hit a number of points in previous discussions that we've had. What are your views on this?
Well, this isn't much of a debate today because I'm enormously agreeing with everything that General Spalding has said today and has said ever since I first spoke to him. And so let me just provide some supplement to what he said. I think that certainly the idea that we're dream walking into it, is true. There was a latent assumption that if we invited China into global economic institutions like the WTO, that as China became a marketized economy and there was the creation of a middle class, that the middle class would want to protect their property rights, and this would lead to a democratization, such as we've seen in places like Taiwan and South Korea. Clearly, as General Spalding points out, that was a naive notion, and China has been able to weaponize access to the West to serve their overall global geostrategic ambitions. And specifically, if one looks at the amount of investment that China's put into the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee, which, according to evidence given to the Canadian Parliament by a Canadian security official, has a larger budget than the entire Chinese Foreign Ministry, with about 50,000 personnel. And then the use of the Belt and Road Program to achieve China's overall strategic purposes. I've done a little bit of work on China's investments into West Africa, and one can see that places that have better ports, facilities for potential Chinese military expansion are getting a lot more investment on a lot more favorable terms than places that might be of less military strategic benefit. So, this idea that came out in the book in 1999 and has been expanded in General Spalding's two books is definitely coming true. But I think there's still reluctance in the West to fully acknowledge what's going on. And China is, like a game of Go, gradually putting down tiles that more and more surround us and could eventually come to squeeze the West in ways that would favor a new world order based on Chinese authoritarian norms centered in Beijing. The belts and roads all terminate in China. So I do think that this is that book was quite revealing, and I think it's a document that we should be looking at much more closely today.
Speaking of the Belt and Road Initiative, better known as the RBI, it's both an economic initiative orchestrated by the Communist Chinese Party, and it's driven by China's global strategic interests. Although cloaked and sold in terms of international trade and economic benefit, it strikes many observers as a classical indirect approach strategy, memories of Liddell Hart. Some have argued that it's based upon China's interests in global defense and indeed its global security, while employing doctrine of civil-military fusion. Both of you are serious observers of Chinese activities. Both of you have chatted about the RBI. But what is the fullest extent, in your view, of the impact upon the United States and Canada?
Well, I think the way that we should look at it is not so much kind of in a military sense. I think we should look at it in the same sense that the United States engaged Western Europe after the end of World War II to rebuild Europe, and also to build the institutions of Europe that were patterned after this idea of liberal democratic order that they wanted to achieve. And I think what the Chinese Communist Party did in studying the fall of the Soviet Union and the eventual success of the Cold War by the U.S. and our allies was this tendency to use economics as a means to bind nations, and then to craft the institutions around the principles that the leader, in this case China, wanted to promote. And I think to do that, they didn't seek to overthrow the current world order. More or less, they sought to basically to just essentially move in and take over. And to do this, they not only so once they created this Belt and Road Initiative, they began to bind these nations to them. The developing nations. By the way, the Marshall Plan ended, and we never really picked up and said, let's go to Latin America, let's go to Africa, let's continue our work. We just kind of stopped. And so the Chinese said, well, this is an enormous opportunity for us to create the same type of world order that the U.S. created during the Cold War, using the Marshall Plan as really kind of the impetus for that. And so they're basically doing that again. And so when you think about the power of the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of the nations that vote for Russia against Ukraine, or vote for China at the United Nations, or vote for China at any of the international institutions of which these nations are all members, you start to begin to see the character of China's ability to move the world order in its direction. And I think the failing of the West is to acknowledge that our strategy during the first Cold War was successful. China learned from that; it's adopted the same strategy, and we haven't risen to the challenge.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with General Spalding here. And, I watch the Chinese national TV news every night, and, there are images of third world leaders, the kind of people, as he said, who will vote with China against genocide resolutions in the UN, or support China's stance on Ukraine, who are seen in the images thanking China for their beneficence, listening to long speeches about China's positive role in the global order, while the third world country leader is taking copious notes. The Chinese don't seem to take a lot of notes of what the third world leader might say in their brief response, but it really does look similar to the traditional Chinese view of itself in the world as the dominant civilization to which other countries should pay tribute and will be rewarded by China in response, and won't be subject to Chinese aggression if they show themselves to be loyal to China's reinterpretation of the global order on Chinese normative values. So, I think when you look at something like the Belt and Road, it does make us much more aware of the integrated, comprehensive nature of China as a regime, as a party, military, civil, industrial complex that is coordinated by the Chinese Communist Party branches in all of those institutions. So, while we have a separation of the state and the corporate sector, there is nothing that China does in terms of corporate investment that is not with other purposes, such as developing infrastructure that will facilitate the transfer of third world resources, including critical minerals, to China, in addition to providing maybe benefits to corrupt regimes in the third world, and enabling dictatorships that are hostile to American interests in those countries. And so, there's a systemic incompatibility between us and them, and any vision that the West could provide the sort of strong financial alternative to China in the third world is just very difficult to implement in times of economic constraint, when we don't have the same sort of coordination in our approaches as China is able to demonstrate through this system of Chinese Leninist corporate geostrategic ambition. So, I am very much concerned about the direction it's going, because it seems that China's strength and comprehensive rise to power continues, and that our response to it is just not equal to the significant challenge that China places to the future of the world order, as General Spalding points out, as they co-opt our existing institutions and drive some of them into irrelevance to be replaced by what China refers to as the community of the common destiny of mankind, to which they expect those third world leaders, when they come to Beijing, to pay some sort of obeisance to and use Chinese language in their characterization of their own roles in the international order.
There's a subplot at play here too, and that is really the strength of some have called soft power. This ability to see that the West was providing better opportunities for citizens because China has been able to leverage technology, talent, and capital. That narrative has gone over to China. So now China is showing that, hey, its system is doing better to lift the Chinese people out of poverty. And so that former soft power that appealed to the former Soviet Union and Soviet states now is appealing to these same nations of the Belt, the people of these same nations of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's not just the leaders, it's also the people who are looking, they're saying, what system is providing, better opportunities? Now, everybody is neglecting to notice that it's the technology, talent, and capital of the West that China uses to build this. So nevertheless, that soft power now, that burnish, that shine of the West has been tarnished, and now the Chinese Communist Party is the recipient of the belief that they have a better system by the people that are in these nations as well.
I think that that's certainly true, although I do think that China to some extent has overplayed the economic coercion aspect and debt trap diplomacy, and this has had a negative impact on China's prestige in the third world. But they're very clever and adaptable people, and I think they may be able to counter the negative impression that they are leaving by maybe overextending in these areas. So it's just bad news all around for us if we can't pay more attention to Spalding's books and really understand China's intentions, and cease to try and think that we can engage them in friendly ways through dialogue and will somehow bring them into compliance with the norms of the existing international rules-based order, because clearly, there is no evidence that we are able to be successful in just exhortatory admonishment of China. We need to be using serious hard power and soft power to reestablish our position in the world.
Recently, we've seen that China appears to have a regional strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean. There are at least reportedly 17 deep water ports that have been owned or operated by the PRC, with many of them near important sea lanes and which could therefore be viewed as potential dual-use ports. What is the strategic impact for Canada and the United States of having expansive Chinese interests in North America's backyard?
Well, I think again, if you go back to what the United States did in terms of counter the Soviet Union during the first Cold War, it was primarily led by economic efforts, but also bolstered by military. And so I think, again, I see the same patterns arising out of what China is doing. They're basically leading with the economic, and then they're coming in with the military to begin to protect their position. And I again, you have to take a step back and you have to say, okay, we played this, we played this game with the Soviets, and how is it that we don't see the game being played on us? It's just, I can tell you, when I was at the White House, I went and met with USAID and the leadership, and I said, hey, what are we doing? What's our strategy in Africa? And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, Congress gets us money to do these water projects and power projects in Africa. I'm like, yes. What do we do? To what end? What strategic interest are we trying to achieve in this? And what is the strategy for going about achieving that? And so we've basically disconnected any of our development efforts, economic developments. They're far smaller than they were during the first Cold War, and they're also not strategically oriented, and they're not aligned with the same strategy of our allies and partners. So we're all doing good in the world, but we're doing it, and many times the Chinese Communist Party comes in and takes advantage, or basically takes the praise for the success of any program. Like, our money is going to essentially fund the principles and interests of the Chinese Communist Party, because we're not being strategic about how we use it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think, in my own case, personally, my family are early settlers of the island of Barbados in the West Indies. Recently Barbados has abandoned its connection to the Commonwealth by removing the Queen at the time as the head of state. That happened, I think, just last year, and is seeking reparations for slavery, which is a very challenging thing to achieve, considering the very long time since the British stopped slave trade in 1807. But what's happening is, even though Barbados is a very small place of less than 300,000 population on an island which is 21 by 14 miles across, China is everywhere there. The Barbados government speaking very favorably of relations with China. There's been quite a lot of Chinese investment. Young people from Barbados are learning Chinese. It's just staggering how much resources China is able to put into a place that I think lacks a lot of strategic significance, considering where Barbados is situated quite far away from a lot of the other islands. But China's there, and clearly it's just a matter of time as China continues to develop its influence and establish relationships with these countries that continue to have a resentment about colonialism, maybe a resentment that is not fully justified, but China is able to play into that psychology of China being a third world nation that's sympathetic to the aspirations of those countries. But I think ultimately they may regret getting too close into relations with China, because I don't think that the Chinese have anything other than an instrumental view of how they can benefit from relations with the countries in Caribbean and Latin America. There doesn't seem to be a genuine sense of solidarity with those nations. It seems to be a desire to put all of the non-Han peoples on the planet in a position of subordination to the Han, and that which has a certain, I don't know how you put it, fascistic element to it, is troubling, I think. And of course you see that domestically in China, in the creation of the new Chinese race, which tries to eliminate the original founding civilizations that made up the People's Republic of China: the Mongolians, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and the Han Chinese. So I am worried about this, and our relative lack of engagement in these places is creating a vacuum that China is only too happy to fill to potentially their future advantage. And of course, the other difference is the obvious one, which is the Chinese Communist Party thinks they'll be in power forever and can plan in a much longer term than our democratic states, which are inclined to be constrained by the length of time till the next election in terms of investment and planning.
For the past 2 decades, there have been numerous books, authors, observers, academics who basically came out and said that for Canada and the United States, there seems to be a reticence by our respective lawmakers, business communities, and in some cases our bureaucracies, to recognize that China poses an all-pervasive threat in all of its manifestations. Now, there's been recent revelations that have abounded in Chinese interference in Canadian and American bureaucracies and with our elected officials and citizens at the local, regional, and federal levels of politics. Recognizing that these activities have been occurring appears to have stirred the attention of our respective citizenry to Communist Chinese activities. What does this mean in the short and long term as to our relationship with China? And how best can we deal with it in the future?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's clear, and this is my time in government. I saw this, very well. The intelligence community, which is kind of the part of the federal government that provides this notion of a threat, has been entirely informed on China by the think tank community within Washington, D.C., which takes its donations from corporate and financial entities within the United States and outside the country, and so is very much on the engaged side of the aisle. And so, when the intelligence community looks out there and say, "How should we think, you experts on China? How should we think about China and the Chinese Communist Party?" It should be, it's been and consistently and remains to this day to be one of engagement, because the corporate sector and the financial sector that's investing in these think tanks, that's what they want that message to be. And so since the intelligence community is not informing the federal government on the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the citizenry, what you see now is that the citizenry has elected representatives to go to Congress and began to have hearings. And so now you're starting to see the staffs of a lot of these committees, whether that's a committee on competition or, any of the various committees that are focused on China within the Congress. Now that is starting to produce a type of, evidence of this threat that we have, in order to begin to move Washington, D.C. in the right direction. So I guess the one good thing that you can say about, our representative republic is that it does provide the checks and balances. Here, the corporate and financial sector has completely captured the executive branch. And in this case, the legislative branch is able to go outside that and begin to conduct its responsibility to do oversight on the executive branch. That, I think, is entirely consistent with, how the founders thought our constitutional republic might be able to right itself with this kind of a threat. So I do think that you're starting to see now a more of a recognition in Washington, D.C. that we have to go after this. That being said, practicing political warfare is really easy in a society that itself is where politics is blood sport. And so, as I think any democracy is in this day and age. So I think the Chinese Communist Party are able to use the gaps and seams in our society that come from our openness to begin to use that as a means for, getting political outcomes that, in the long run, favor their interests. It's not hard when you have the executive branch, which is really not looking at the Chinese Communist Party in the way it should. And most of those people are permanent party, either civilian or military. And so, and on the political side, in the legislative branch, you have a turnover every 2 years in the Congress and 6 years in the Senate. So it's hard to get the type of staying power the executive branch has. And so this requires people, the citizenry, to continue to be engaged and knowledgeable. And herein, the corporate sector has an advantage in that, within the United States, the media, by and large, is owned by 5 large corporate entities, and all of the media is essentially aligned. This is as opposed to where we used to have local papers and local media that and local editors that could add their own flavor to the news. Now you get pretty much the same thing, no matter what channel you go to, except it's couched in the politics of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So it's a very, very effective cocktail that I think supports what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do within our societies. In that and I see the same thing in Canada. The executive is kind of long term. The China people are in the organizations. They fail to point out the threats, which are different than the traditional threats, and so there's no response by the machinery of the federal government. And so it requires the people to begin to use the power of the vote to begin to change things. And I think that's finally beginning to happen.
Charles.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in Canada, we do have probably a more serious problem of elite capture than in the United States. And part of it is, due to the Canadian system, the Westminster system, concentrating so much power into the office of the Prime Minister without the kinds of checks and balances that one sees in the US system, where Congress is a much more independent force than the Canadian Parliament can be under a Westminster system. So, as we've had since, I guess, getting on for 10 months now, a series of leaked intelligence assessments that had been sent to the center of our government, to the Prime Minister's office or cabinet ministers, that somehow or other, according to a report issued by the former Governor General of Canada, David Johnston, did not reach policymakers and therefore weren't acted on. These were all reports talking about Chinese political influence and interference in Canadian democratic processes. So, we've had, in response to this, government initiatives. We have a statement that was produced quite a number of months ago of an Indo-Pacific strategy, which defines China as a disruptive force in global affairs. That has been countered by our foreign ministry, saying that disruptive is not necessarily a negative thing. The internet was also disruptive. And so clearly, the intention of that report, which is to suggest that Canada should be more aware of China's role in international affairs, is being diluted. And there's been no articulated statement on exactly how Canada would implement the Indo-Pacific strategy. It seems to be an aspirational document that may disappear into the back of a drawer. Then, in response to the intelligence assessments, that were suggesting serious concerns on the part of our security and intelligence establishment about Chinese activities in Canada, there is supposed to be the appointment of a public inquiry into this matter, but this one, seems to be also in abeyance. The minister responsible, Dominic LeBlanc, recently saying it's complicated. We've had a complicated response to when the government promised electoral reform and then decided not to do it. And finally, there were some public consultations with regard to Canada implementing legislation comparable to the US Foreign Agents Registry Act or the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, and these are similarly not being acted on. So we have a situation, similar to what General Spalding's referring to, which is that the Canadian public wants to see much more aggressive response by Canada towards China. This is well demonstrated in polling data, which suggests that only about 16% of our population are satisfied with how our government's been responding. We're getting a lot of pressure from our allies, particularly the United States, with regard to Canada's lack of enthusiastic support for like-minded nations to work in concert to try and respond to China's increasing malign influence in global affairs. And I think we'll probably get to this later in the conversation about Canada's exclusion from the Australia-UK-US alliance, Canada's exclusion from the Quad. The UK is involved, but Canada is really an Indo-Pacific country and the UK isn't, and concerns about Canada's lack of investment in our defense establishment, particularly with regard to defense of the Arctic, where China is more and more active. And we've got recent evidence of China's making preparations for the future possibility of sending nuclear submarines into Canadian Arctic waters. So, on the one hand, we have the press and the public who want the government to respond to China. And on the other hand, we seem to have a sort of virtue signaling by our government, but a lack of response. And I think, frankly, I think that there are a lot of people in influential positions of policy who may be under the impression that if they don't do anything that will get their name on a blacklist in the Chinese embassy in Ottawa, that opportunities in law firms and boards of Canadian companies who are involved in China may be available to them when they leave positions of public trust, possibly relatively early in their careers, like in their 50s. And so we're seeing a lot of deferring this to my successor rather than responding with substantive policy measures to counter this. And in the meantime, China continues to move from strength to strength in this regard. If we don't have any resolution of Chinese influence activities in our elections, so far we've only expelled one single agent of the Chinese Ministry of State Security who had diplomatic cover in Canada that one of the documents revealed was active in seeking to prepare to intimidate the family in China of the Conservative Party Foreign Affairs Committee, Foreign Affairs critic, Michael Chong. If we don't expel more of them, if we don't actually make an investigation of Chinese illegal funding and disinformation and coercion in our political electoral process, then I think China would surely be emboldened to do more of it in the next election. And, that really goes against the fundamental core principles of Canadian democracy. So, we certainly are influenced by what we're hearing going on down south in the United States in terms of a much more aware approach to China in its activities domestically in the United States and internationally. But so far, Canada, while expressing sympathy, is not actually doing anything of a substantive nature to indicate that we are going to take the China threat seriously.
So, for a question for both, what do you see as the key challenges for the AUKUS, the Quad, NATO, and Pacific nations regarding China's progressively aggressive expansionistic initiatives in the Pacific? And what can we do and what must be done?
Well, I think it comes from kind of the same things I've been talking about here. Anything that we're doing in order to promote the vibrancy of the West, whether it be in a strategic sense in terms of productivity, or in a more of a soft power sense to promote the economic opportunity of our citizens, requires that these elements of our principles are established and maintained and protected. And since the Chinese Communist Party has entered the global economic domain, it has basically sullied the waters, and it uses its connections to all the nations of the West to basically undermine those principles and values. And so we end up stagnating. And so all of these, the AUKUS and the Quad and all of these things, are primarily meant to be security relationships first and economic relationships second. And really therein lies our inability to compete, directly with China. They are focused on the economic, which is important. That binds the nations to their interests in ways that the military does not. And it also provides an opportunity for the citizens to look towards China as the opportunity that the United States used to provide in the world, and its allies. And so I think, we tend to say that decoupling is not on the table because, it's impossible. And it's not impossible. It's hard. But anything that's of value is hard. But importantly, what decoupling would bring would be this ability to get back to the principles and values of the liberal democratic order, to enforce those principles and values amongst the collaborating nations, and then to see the citizenry reap the benefits of the technology, talent, and capital that comes from living in a free society and not having that be usurped by China's tentacles. And so I think in doing so, you begin to further the economic morass that China finds itself in, and you strengthen the economic opportunity and productivity of the free world. And so creating this and embracing this idea of a bipolar world, and forcing the Chinese to to make their system work without the benefit of having connection to free societies is precisely what needs to happen. But the corporate and financial sector sees a financial opportunity in China, and China uses that to keep them bound to them, and thereby binding the political systems of the countries that they where they reside. And so this is the problem. And unless we can get away from this, none of these security relationships, NATO, AUKUS, the Quad, none of them are going to be successful. It has to start from economics. It has to start from first principles. Those nations have to be bound, and they have to isolate the authoritarian nations from participating in that benefit so that they don't usurp the benefit for their own interests.
I think we need to regain the respect of the Chinese by indicating that we're not going to put up with their challenge to our liberal society. We're not going to put up with Chinese agents harassing persons of Chinese origin and trying to intimidate them through threatening their families and economic coercion. The large cohort of Chinese diplomats and their agents who are engaged in this kind of activity have to be shown the door. And I think certainly in terms of Chinese investment, we have to say that we are going to defend our security interests by not allowing China to invest in key sectors such as critical minerals mining, and that Canada will, put the investment in to find the critical minerals in our north and provide an alternative source of supply to the countries that need them, so that they won't be subject to coercion by China, particularly South Korea, where we worry about the Taiwan situation. But if the Korean Peninsula was reunited into a pro-China regime, that would really be a very bad thing for global peace. So I think that we have to say we're not going to allow them to continue with their espionage, including in their various means of transfer of sophisticated dual-use Western technologies through think tanks and universities, and I think once we've made it clear to China that we understand what they're doing, it's not acceptable to us, we won't tolerate anymore, and we will make the hard decisions to constrain this abuse of our liberal democratic freedoms by a hostile foreign power, that China will be more inclined to recognize that we have to work in a collaborative, fair and transparent way, or China will suffer devastating economic consequences as that nation is excluded from the global economy. And we so far we haven't been willing to take those hard steps, because of course so many of the businesses who have extensive relationships with Chinese Communist business networks are pressuring our governments not to engage China in these other areas, such as countering Chinese espionage or agents of the Chinese regime subverting our democratic processes and so on. So I think I think they perceive certainly Canada as weak and easily manipulated and deceived, and it's time for us to put an end to that kind of perception that we're giving China, that Canada can be used as a base to expand their power and obtain key elements to their military expansion, and to provide China with a base in North America through the Arctic and Canada to further challenge the United States.
There's an issue here of open borders that have been of notable concern to our respective national security establishments, in particular the large number of undocumented foreigners accessing our respective nations for some time now. This situation provides a venue for criminal, terrorist, and enemy intelligence operatives to enter our respective nations. In the latter case, a number of security analysts have advised that China has utilized this venue to introduce operatives and sleeper cells into North America. To what extent is this a real concern for American and Canadian national security? And if so, how should we address this serious threat now and into the future? General.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying, anytime that you can slip agents into your enemy's homeland, you should take advantage of that. And given the fact that we've done a very poor job, we in the U.S., of securing our border against that kind of infiltration, I think we can expect that we have a lot of them. The tens of thousands of Chinese have flown through the southern border. That's despite the fact that we've got exit bans. There's exit bans by the Chinese Communist Party in China. So how are these people getting out of China in order to then travel down and then come up through our southern border? These are the questions that I would, any intel analyst should be asking. And so I think it's without a doubt that we have a problem, and we're just unwilling to face that problem.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in Canada, there's a big issue of Chinese agents of the Chinese police and Ministry of State Security who are able to enter our country on false visa applications. So the regime supports the falsification of their background so that they can enter Canada ostensibly as business people or other purposes, not to speak of the very serious problem of PLA researchers who have insinuated themselves into Canadian labs engaged in research which serves the interests of the Chinese regime and the priorities of their 5-year planning process. So, it is a matter that Canada's not putting enough resources into establishing who is who when they come into our country, and who are legitimate migrants and visitors, and who are people who are coming into Canada for purposes that they are not declaring when they apply for the visa. And this is just indicative of the lack of priority the Canadian government is putting into China-based expertise in this process of immigration, and in terms of assessing the activities of the Chinese regime in Canada. So, it really is all about we need to be more aware of what's going on, take it more seriously, and address it. When we detect these agents of the Chinese police who are in Canada attempting to force the return of persons who have come here to seek refuge, we have never prosecuted a single one of them. All we have done is send them home earlier than they were planning, once we've established that they aren't who they said they were. And I mean, this is just not good enough. We need to be putting people into prison for violating Canadian law.
Along the same lines, federal law enforcement agencies in both the United States and Canada have acknowledged that China has utilized businesses, particularly casinos and others, to launder monies that were subsequently returned to China to purchase fentanyl to be marketed in North America. As drug warfare was identified as a non-kinetic methodology, as outlined in the book Unrestricted Warfare, and represents a multi-level, multifaceted strategy that garners large sums of money for Chinese drug dealers and those involved, but it also lays waste to a nation's most important asset, its youth and its ability to effectively contribute to our respective societies. How can we effectively stymie this most serious Chinese threat, domestic, that impacts the safety and security of our youth and respective societies? General, your views.
Yeah, it's not a criminal activity. It is a systemic threat to the country and ought to be treated as such. So we, in the United States, we're treating it as criminal activity by individuals and cartels and groups. That's true, but it is a systemic problem. And the heart of the problem is the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to allow this activity to happen because it benefits them. And so I think we haven't been tying the types of sticks that would see the Chinese Communist Party change its direction. Trade is an enormous lever in the relationship, and basically, and I've said this time and time again, tell the Chinese Communist Party not a single ship will unload at port if this doesn't stop. They have the means and ability to stop it. There is no fentanyl problem in China because all the drug dealers know they can sell overseas. They just can't sell in China or they'll end up dead. They have total control over the population. And so I think we just haven't forced them to stop. And it is an attack. It is a physical attack as much as Pearl Harbor was, as much as any attack, 9/11 on the population of the United States. And it's having devastating impact on our society, but it's just like we're asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, I mean, a few years ago, I wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail expressing dismay that the Canadian government was providing funding to the Chinese police to facilitate their investigation of the sources of fentanyl that was coming from mostly Guangdong province into Canada at that time. I mean, I certainly think that the Chinese do have some echoes of the Opium Wars and the idea that, the West was able to facilitate the transfer of opium into China against Chinese law at the time. Well, briefly when they attempted to stop the opium, and then there was the Opium War, which resulted in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 that the Chinese Communist Party, I think, puts far too much emphasis on in terms of historiography, but that's another story. But there does seem to be a kind of feeling of smug satisfaction among the Chinese who claim that the fentanyl issue is a Canadian issue and not really a Chinese issue, whereas in fact if it wasn't for the Chinese government showing willful blindness, as Sam Cooper's book entitles it, towards this process, we wouldn't have as devastating an issue as we have. And the Canadian government's unbelievable turning a blind eye to the money laundering involved in this, which is really about Chinese people putting money into illegal banking in China, run by criminal gangs who are involved in the fentanyl business, to try and repatriate the fentanyl profits in Canada. So, we have these extraordinary stories of Chinese people who've come to Canada, who are restricted in the amount of foreign currency they're able to bring out of China to $50,000 a year, who are being met in parking lots by agents of these gangs, who bring trunk loads full of small Canadian bills, 20s, wrapped in rubber bands, which is not the way banks hand over foreign currency, which they put into large duffel bags or hockey bags, as we would define them in Canada, take them to casinos, purchase chips in the casinos, may gamble or not gamble, and then turn those chips into checks, which they then use to invest in Canadian real estate. I mean, this is just the most outrageous process. And the fact that this is well known, that we've had the Cullen Commission in BC, to clarify that this is really going on, and we haven't effectively stopped this major money laundering operation, which is not just in BC, but also in Ontario, really is a suggestion of this willful blindness process and a suggestion of, some degree of corruption within the Canadian system. Everybody, maybe even General Spalding, might think that Canadians are sort of Dudley do-right, honest people compared to other nations, but it turns out that we may be just as human as everybody else, and when there's money to be made, we turn a blind eye to the source of it.
This is something that you alluded to earlier, Charles, that the CCP fully appreciates that the West does not want to be viewed as racist, and therefore our respective governments and their representatives often walk on diplomatic eggshells when dealing with contentious issues. How can we address this negotiating ploy so as to mitigate kowtowing to Chinese initiatives during negotiations?
Well, I mean, certainly there's a high degree of sensitivity to anything that sounds like racism. And the way that the Chinese regime and their agents in Canada, their proxies in Canada, put it is any criticism of the activities of the People's Republic of China, including, attempts to engage in refusing to allow the import into Canada of products of slave labor in the Uyghur regions, is defined as racist. And the Chinese ambassador, previous ambassador, a well-known Wolf warrior, now ambassador in France, Lu Chaillet, talked about Canada as a white supremacist society. It's it's completely counterfactual. I mean, after all, the recently elected mayor of Toronto is a person of Han Chinese origin from Hong Kong. And the idea that Canada has systemic racism against persons of Chinese origin is just not borne out by the reality. But this kind of discourse not only is designed to cause Canadian policymakers from backing off on any kind of activity that the Chinese embassy would not like to see. It also is designed to give a false impression to persons of Chinese origin in Canada that they are not fully participants in our process of citizenship here, and therefore that those persons of Chinese origin should seek their refuge and loyalty to a foreign state, the People's Republic of China, even if they, are citizens of Canada. So the Chinese believe that anybody who is of Chinese ethnic origin, even partially as descendants of the Yellow Emperor, should be loyal to the purposes of the Chinese Communist Party as determined out of Beijing. So we really have to be doing much more to bring our Canadian Chinese into our mainstream society, to respond much more vigorously to the Chinese government's activities through the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party, to try and subvert the confidence of Canadians of Chinese origin in their Canadian citizenship, and act against the sources of disinformation that have been damaging to our electoral process, including, the likely loss of 8 seats held by persons of Chinese origin in Canada in the last election because they were subject to disinformation that suggested that they were acting against Chinese purposes by proposing support for foreign agents registry and these other measures designed to counter China's illegal subversive activities in our country. But it's a very hard row to hoe because of the woke sensibilities in Canada, which are based in this culture wars, which suggests that any persons of color are not being fairly treated by societies that are dominated, according to them, by white people. And increasingly in Canada, we are seeing much more participation by persons of color in our political process. And it just isn't true that Chinese people in Canada are not subject to full and fair citizenship. And we have, in fact, apologized for measures in the past that were discriminatory against Chinese in Canada. So it's a pretty ugly business when China is trying to foment racial hatred in our country.
General, your views on this?
Yeah, I just think that we ought to stand on the principles and values that the liberal democratic order was created upon, and one is rule of law. And law, certainly means that the law applies equally to everyone, no matter their circumstance or race or gender or what have you. And I think that is a part where you start to understand that there is no rule of law in China. So it's rule by law, and it's rule, and that law is whatever the Chinese Communist Party determines to be. So the likelihood that systemic racism exists in China is quite high, because there is no rule of law, and that law is not anything but arbitrary and capricious. And so I think focusing on the fact that we have come through a very long process of ensuring that the law applies to everybody equally, and therefore, our society is one of meritocracy, is very important. And I think there's been Charles uses the word culture war. I think there's been a deliberate undermining of the principles and values of the liberal democratic order in the academy. So the universities have created this environment where there's a lot of desire to unwind the principles and values in the institutions of the West, for some because of the sins of the past, rather than embracing what the West stands for, and that is, again, the rule of law, meritocracy, the idea that we're judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin.
Yeah.
And so that is the case. It is done. It's fact based. You know, in the 50s, I think 4% of the population of the United States believed in interracial marriage or thought it was acceptable. Today, over 90%. So you can't say that the West has systemic racism. We have rule of law. That law treats everyone the same. There will always be bias in any human endeavor. But we have risen to, enormous heights in the West. Tearing it down will absolutely bring racism, and that's exactly what the Chinese Communist Party wants. They are anything if not the ultimate racist. That is their system. By not having a rule of law system, by allowing their law to be arbitrary and capricious, they can define who is, the good race and who's the bad race. And then if you look at, just kind of how foreigners and how, blacks, for example, are treated in China, you get to understanding that's real racism. And so I think, understanding and having confidence in our own society and our own system, our own willingness to address the past and promote this future where, we get ever better at ensuring that the law treats everyone equal. That's what we should be focused on, and we should have confidence that when it comes to two systems, which one's more racist than the other, there's no doubt that the system that does not have rule of law is going to be the more racist system, and we ought to confidently state that.
Yeah, we have to be more assertive in suggesting that our society is based on principles that provide equal opportunity for all, and that if there are episodes of racism in Canada, they will be addressed through the law, because it's against the law to discriminate against persons of different races in our country. Thank goodness for that.
Both of you have touched upon a number of points in previous discussions, but arguably since 2000, the West have been blinded by our business interests and political belief that engaging with China would make the CCP more liberal and democratic in form. To date, this has not been the case, and now we are confronted with the pervasive PRC infiltration into our universities, private and public research and development facilities, and other areas of government. What are the costs of not dealing effectively with this multifaceted threat, and what has been lost due to our failure to address it?
The cost is we are going to become authoritarian. We're already starting to exhibit those tendencies, and what we lose is this ability to become an ever better place for humanity. And I think that's what we're losing. We're losing this inevitable march where the principles and values of the West become more enshrined in the way we live our lives. And that's what we're losing. We are basically going backwards.
Yeah, I think in Canada, certainly, we're losing our history, the destruction of statues to famous Canadian historical figures, the removal of all the references to history in the printing of our passports recently is indicative that, how can we maintain our democracy if we don't understand how we got to the kind of society that Canada has today, which is what makes Canada such a great country and such an attractive beacon for people to immigrate into. And so I am very concerned about this increasing authoritarian tendency and the increasing admiration in the world for the Chinese autocratic system, as opposed to the hope that a society based on respect for human rights and the values of citizenship should be being maintained in the world. I mean, we really, how many countries that have achieved democratic electoral government based on rule of law want to go back to an authoritarian autocratic system? Once you've achieved that, people will not allow it to be debased, but in countries like Canada and arguably the United States, we're seeing a backwards movement away from those cherished values that protect the rights of all citizens to arbitrary political power based on just the authority of who has more power and a debasing of the importance of reciprocal fairness in domestic and international relations. And this at my stage in life, this is very concerning. I'm really wondering what sort of Canada there will be for my children.
Absolutely. How can we best entice our business investors and entrepreneurs to withdraw or preempt investment initiatives from China or into China and make it more attractive to move their respective investments and activities back to their home country or look for a friend-shoring opportunity? General.
We just have to make it illegal for them to do so. I mean, that's what we did during the first Cold War. We didn't allow it to happen. It is not something that they're going to do voluntarily. The government has to step in and force the issue because they're not going to do it. And ultimately, it's going to lead to our downfall if we don't. So, I mean, this is what the federal government is supposed to do. During when the Constitution was written, we said we must form an army and a navy. That's when the threats were more or less physical. Now they're coming through the internet. Now they're coming through global trade. And I think we have to accept that fact and acknowledge it and deal with it, in the same way we did during the first Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, as I pointed out in the example of Canada having resolution to ban the import of slave labor products from China, and not a single incident of any successful stopping of import of those products into Canada has occurred, unlike the United States, which has been quite effective at least starting to be effective in preventing industries from benefiting from products of slave labor. And I think in general, we can't rely on consumers to reject the products from China, which may threaten our own economic systems. But I think we do have to enforce these laws that prevent industries from threatening our security by opening up our country to economic coercion. And so far, the political will in Canada is clearly not there. And obviously, companies are interested in maximizing profit for their shareholders and deflecting public concerns. And we're just not able to come to terms with that yet. But if we don't, it's at our peril because of China is not reciprocal in that regard, and they certainly understand the importance of maintaining their national security through economic measures that we aren't.
One of the issues that I have reflected on is the amount of billions of dollars that research and development has lost in the West, particularly in Canada, the United States in particular. Do we have a number of R&D dollars that we have lost through theft or infiltration or other means?
Yeah, I mean, we've stated somewhere between $300 and $600 billion a year, every year, is lost through this, and it's been stated numerous times in front of Congress. I think it's you've been quoted as the biggest transfer of wealth in human history. Again, that was done for good. We felt for good reasons, this ability to help liberalize China as they became rich. But of course, the Chinese Communist Party had other designs. So yeah, it's massive.
I mean, I think there's actually proportionately the estimates for Canada are larger than 10% of the American number. I've heard 70, but in any event, China through gray means, acquisition of Canadian companies that have technologies that China needs, or espionage, cyber espionage, or use of people who are working in key areas that have knowledge of technology being enticed to China to transfer that technology through, some means which maybe bribery, maybe the use of blackmail, maybe even such trite things as honeypot activities is leading to enormous damage to the Canadian economy and to military technologies that serve the Five Eyes intelligence sharing consortium, which seems to be increasingly turning into 3 or lately possibly 4, including New Zealand, but that there does seem to be a perception that Canada is a weak link in terms of technology transfer, which is not good for Canada in terms of where our future alliance will lie, particularly if the United States feels that Canada is not a reliable partner and becomes more and more reluctant to share intelligence with us because of the risk of it leaking out to China, both military intelligence and these strategic technologies.
On behalf of the Policy Insights Forum, I want to express our deep appreciation for your time today, Dr. Burton, Dr. Spalding. Thank you for an informative session regarding the threat posed by the Communist Chinese Party to the United States of Canada and the West. Gentlemen, thank you. Hope to see you soon.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.